coming.
Hi. I felt guilty not coming. I didn't think there'd be more than 3, but
I didn't either.
we had 9 at the
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I bumped into Jonathan. He was still here when I came. So he joked, oh, if you're only 20 minutes.
Yeah, we were hoping you were going to come real early.
No, I didn't
I
come.
know.
So, yeah.
And one of the 9 was Marty Kirker,
Oh.
and he didn't know it was Shavuos. He was
Oh.
coming for morning meeting.
Yeah, because he usually comes on Monday. Okay.
Yeah, that's just what he said, so.
Yeah.
Too bad.
Okay.
So
My
who
wife predicts there'll be no more early Vizker. I said, it's because it's Shavuos. People, it's sad, but it's an ignored holiday.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say it's the most underrated.
Yeah.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Rabbi.
I would say we have the little leaf thing.
All right.
But also, there wasn't any service listings.
Yeah.
Chag Sameach. We will do, we still have a little bit of light. We'll do the afternoon service for festivals, page 226 in our Siddur.
Ashrei Ashrei Vetecha Od Yahalalucha Selah. Tehillat Adonai yedaber pi, v'yivarecha b'asar shem kadsho le'olam va'ed, v'anachnu nevarech ya, me'ata v'yad olam, hallelujah. ויפתחו בך יודעי שמך, כי לא עזבת דורשך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה וידיר.
We rise for the Amidah for festivals. Our leader will recite page 242a aloud. The remainder will be pages 244 through 246.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov,
האל הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, אל עליון, גומל חסדים טובים, וקונה הכל, וזוכר חסדי אבות, ומביא גואל לבני בניהם, למען שמו באהבה, מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן, ברוך אתה אדוני, מגן אברהם, אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומדום מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה, ונאמן אתה להחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים. אתה קדוש ושמך קדוש, וקדושים בכל יום יהללוך סלה, ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש.
Aleinu is on page 248.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלוכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
In my time of need to reflect on and hope for a better world, the proper setting to recite the words Yikadal v'Yikadash Shemei Rabbah is not available to me, but the words still call V'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon of yomechon, that God's rule soon be accepted during my life. Yibarach v'yishtabach v'pa'ar v'yitramam v'yidnaseh, praised and celebrated, lauded and worshipped. May you bring peace to the universe, all of us and to me. Let us say, Amen. So, now, yesterday evening, we did services at sort of the normal evening service time at 6 p.m. And so why are we doing this so late today? And it's because one practice that I follow is that you do have a certain amount of leeway when it comes to going from one day of Yom Tov to the next. In other words, you can begin a second day of Yom Tov. You can bring it in. There's a pretty wide berth in how how you can sort of bring it in a little earlier. But for the end of Yom Tov, it would be disingenuous to say Mariv when it isn't actually dark, when we can't, and to do Havdalah when it really isn't time to say Havdalah. So it is late, I know, but I do want to make sure that we are, getting to Havdalah. I think 9:41 is the time where we can do that. So, Steve, I'll ask you maybe in the back to just watch the time. So 9:30. And so I don't know if anybody's watching on live stream. If you are, please wave at me. Okay, no. But for the sake of those who are here and for the sake of anybody listening on live stream, I figure what I can do is between now and 9:30 is to, talk a little Torah. And so, I mean, I've done this other times, so if you have seen me do something like this before, I hope the monologue will be okay. If you're, going to tune out, and that's fine too, whatever you like to do. As you might know, prior to Shavuot, I did a quick little two-part class on 3 things you got to know about every book of the Hebrew Bible. And it's a list. It was, and it's basically that. It was sort of going through this list of these particular books, and the idea was to make 3, like the 3 most important things you should know. Now, I don't know if my list, how well it did that job. I mean, I tried to hit the highlights, and obviously some books are much easier to highlight than others. I would say the shorter books are much easier to highlight because there's fewer things to choose from, and you can kind of go 1, 2, 3 usually. But a book like Breshit, a book like Genesis, I mean, where do you even start to whittle it down to 3 things? It's pretty tough. So we had some good discussions on that, and so what I thought I would do is kind of expand on maybe some of the things that might not for everyone necessarily be common knowledge. I feel like people's biblical literacy, and I use that phrase intentionally because I'm going to quote from the Rabbi Joseph Telushkin book called Biblical Literacy. I feel like people's general knowledge of biblical literacy, at least among Jews outside of Israel, is not especially high. Now, and listen, there are plenty of areas of Jewish education where we wish, where maybe I might wish that people might know more, but I would say that, there's just, because there are so many sacred texts in Judaism, and because for so long Talmud has been emphasized for good reason in many ways, I would say that a typical Jew with let's say some knowledge would know on average less about the Hebrew Bible than a Christian with an equivalent amount of religious knowledge. And I think the reason is that, Bible study is very much, of course, emphasized in Christianity. I don't know, I wouldn't know where to put, a knowledgeable Muslim in that, in that rubric. If somebody else knows, I'd be happy to hear. But, in Christianity, Bible study is just such a key component of their adult, really education for all ages. Obviously, in Christianity, it is both Hebrew Bible and Christian Bible. And obviously, we're only dealing here with the Hebrew Bible. But I remember somebody telling me this and saying this when they were, well, I think when I was a teenager, that one of the reasons why so many serious Jewish students traditionally would focus so heavily on the Talmud is because, because they would say that, well, other religions have adopted our Bible as also part of their Bible. But Talmud, that's ours. That's all ours, right? And not that Talmud is closed for study for people other than Jews. It certainly isn't. But I understand the general point, right? But I think that's why, in the, you only have 168 hours a week, and you got to spend, supposedly about a third of that sleeping at least. You only have so much time, right? You only have so much time to get through all this information. I do think that it is important for educated Jews, for knowledgeable Jews. Well, I certainly emphasize the importance of Jews being knowledgeable about the tradition, and then for knowledgeable Jews to to reclaim knowledge of the Hebrew Bible as best they can. And this is not to negate interpretations and comments by scholars of other religions. They often have some very interesting and insightful things to say about the Hebrew Bible. It might not align with our religious beliefs, but they got interesting things to say, and there's certainly value in the knowledge. But we have to also know that, this is our, when I say every week that we're going to take out a Torah scroll to continue the study of our sacred story, and indeed the Torah is our sacred story, but it's just the beginning of it. So all of this is a preamble to really say that I just think that biblical literacy has somehow over time become somewhat underrated in the sort of the annals of Jewish knowledge. Thanks to, as we talked about at great length over the course of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, thankfully we had at least a couple of our speakers speak of how great it is to have Sefaria.org, what an incredible and unprecedented tool it is to have every Jewish text readily accessible, readily available with commentaries of the wazoo. And, so much of it, so many Hebrew commentaries and many English commentaries as well. That it is, the information, like so much of Jewish knowledge these days, like so much knowledge period, is very much at our fingertips. We have ample opportunity to not only become biblically literate, but to become really very good at it. It's all out there, and I think the key is to make it an inviting thing, and to note that yes, perhaps some of these stories have become part of the heritage of other religions, but it's part of our heritage too. So, with that said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of walk through, with whatever time we have, a handful of the areas that Telushkin highlights in the Hebrew Bible that perhaps are not among the best known, that perhaps they're not exactly the ones at the top of people's lists. So one I'm going to speak about is, so let's start with the book of Joshua, as it's the first book after the end of the Torah, the first biblical book. Generally, what people know about the book of Joshua is that it's the happy ending that the Torah never got. When the Torah ends, Moses dies. The people are not yet in the promised land. It really kind of ends on a cliffhanger. No pun intended. I know Moses died on a mountain, but that's not what we're saying. It's really very much on a cliffhanger. And the book of Joshua provides bits and pieces of that legacy, but then really, really glorifies everything that the Israelites are capable of doing and of being if they would only listen to God and to their human leader, in this case, Joshua. Moses is demoralized over the course of his 40 years with setback after setback, mainly setbacks that were not of his own doing, setbacks of the Israelites just being skeptical and then at times outright hostile. And Moses, what is described in the book of Deuteronomy is Moses really trying to set the table and say, okay, just, you guys gave me such grief. Can you not do that for the next person, please? And for the most part, the Israelites follow through. There is this sense of, oh yeah, I guess we really shouldn't do that anymore. I mean, a big part of that, though, is the fact that it is a new generation, as I mentioned on Shabbat. It is a generation that had not left Egypt and had not, dealt with some of the worst setbacks in the wilderness. So this new generation is certainly, an improvement, in terms of their level of cooperation. And for the most part, they are everything that you could have hoped for. Joshua takes over, leads the people across the Jordan River. There is the famous siege of Jericho, the triumphant tumbling of the walls of Jericho, and the Israelites are off and running. But then we have an episode that threatens to derail all of that. And it centers around a person named Achan. I'm going to read from Telushkin's book here. All Israel are responsible for one another is a famous Talmudic maxim from Shavuot 39a. One meaning of this maxim, Jewish tradition teaches, is that one Jew's sins may cause others to suffer. A proof text for this rabbinic belief is the incident of Achan, an Israelite soldier who fights in Jericho and who, despite Joshua's admonition to refrain from looting the city, steals silver, gold, and a cloak and hides them all in his tent. Amid the chaos of battle, no one notices Achan's thievery except God. God responds with fury, withdrawing God's protection from the Israelite army. Thus, when an Israelite force follows their victory over Jericho with an attack on the city of Ai, it's spelled A-I, the Israelites are routed and 36 soldiers die. Joshua and the elders rend their garments and fall prostrate before God's ark. So let me just sort of make sure everybody knows the context here. So they conquer Jericho so easily. One Israelite defies the order to not loot the residents of Jericho as well. Okay, one person messes it up. And God says, well, if that's how you're going to be, and the Israelites lose the next battle. Now, might not be fair to punish the entire people based on one person's mistake. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers that the Israelites have, according to the census. One mess up is going to, take everything away. That might seem very harsh. But I think what's behind this is God is saying, we have to have a zero tolerance policy here. One mess up, and the rest of the people are just going to go back to their ways. I've seen the people go back to their bad habits over and over and over again. Moses saw it repeatedly. After the people said, no, we won't do it again, we won't do it again, we won't do it again. So God has to, so God and then Joshua gets the message, we have to nip this in the bud right away. Even one person's wrongdoing can mess up the whole thing. So back to Telushkin here. God responds by informing Joshua of the violation of the cherem, the ban on taking any possessions from Jericho. God says that God's withdrawal of support from the Israelite army will continue until the stolen property is confiscated, and instructs Joshua to bring together the Israelites on the following day and to conduct a kind of lottery during which the guilty party will be exposed. So basically it's this, so picture this, it's this reality game basically where who is the, who's the guilty party here? It's almost like a reality show there. The following morning, Joshua gathers the tribes. Joshua first figures out that the offender belongs to the tribe of Judah. Subsequent disclosures expose the offender as belonging to the clan of Zerach and the house of Zabdi. Finally, a man named Achan is exposed as the thief. Achan quickly confesses his sin against God and tells Joshua where the property is hidden. The stolen goods are brought to Joshua, who gathers the booty and also has Achan's family rounded up, since presumably they knew he was hiding banned property in their tent. What calamity have you brought upon us, Joshua declares. The Adonai will bring calamity upon you this day. Achan is pelted with stones, then burned with fire. He is buried under a large heap of stones. The text is ambiguous as to whether his family members are killed as well, but it seems more likely than not they were. Punishment during the age of Joshua was not dispensed with a gentle hand. One of the comments that I got when we were talking about the book of Joshua last week was just there are some scenes of real brutality. This is one of them. I would say that the scenes of brutality get even more pronounced as the books of the prophets continue, as Joshua turns into Judges, which turns into the books of Samuel and Kings. There are some harsh and really gruesome things to be found. And this is, and certainly we're not here to excuse it. But what I would say first of all is that most likely these punishments were on par or perhaps even gentler than those of other neighboring cultures. It's not like neighboring cultures were, at the time of the Israelites, had bans on cruel and unusual punishment, and here the Israelites were being savages or anything like that. I mean, it's the likelihood is very much the opposite, that the Israelites are they may have been on the gentler side of things in comparison, or probably on par with other places. Not that it doesn't excuse it at all, but it just does kind of put that in perspective, that this was sort of how justice was often dispensed with at the time. And I think we can understand the story that God is saying, if one person messes up like this, we're going to go down that same path, that same negative path that we've gone on. And the thing is, that often plays out in other biblical books. And obviously, I do not endorse the harshness of it or the zero tolerance of it, but I think the main point that we each have a responsibility to conduct ourselves in an ethical way, because it has consequences consequences much larger than ourselves if we don't. That is certainly very clear. How are we doing on time here? 15 minutes. Okay, I figured I was in that ballpark, so that's good. All right. So that's one thing that happens in the book of Joshua. And like I said, the book of Joshua has this really happy ending. I mean, it's almost comically happy, where Joshua is giving his farewell address before he dies and says, "Remember, you need to follow the commandments." And the people are saying, "Yes, yeah, we're we're on board. Can't wait. We're 100% there." And Joshua says, "Good," and then that's the end of his life. It's like the end of many sitcom episodes, right? Everything just works out. So obviously this is pretty harsh. Maybe what I'll do for the rest of the time we have here is to talk of perhaps a brighter example of everything that a biblical leader can be, and this is the story of Gideon, and again, not one that is perhaps that well known. It's from chapters 6 through 8 of the book of Judges. To get a little perspective on this, from time to time on my blog, I quote a book by a journalist, a contemporary journalist named David Plotz. He wrote a book called Good Book, and the reason why he wrote it was because, he was somebody who, grew up, he had a bar mitzvah, he went to Hebrew school, things like that. He generally, proudly identifies as a Jew, but, not, never really had much in the way of observance, or, his Jewish education was kind of off to the side, whatever it might be. And so he tells the story that, into his adulthood, after he married and he'd started a family, he was at his niece's bat mitzvah. And he's sitting in synagogue, and I don't know, maybe he's just not in the mood to pray at the particular moment. He picks up the Chumash, and he, just starts, opens up to a random page. Well, the random page he happens to open it is Genesis chapter 34, which tells the story of the rape of Dinah. And he looks at it just absolutely aghast. Obviously, it is a shocking and highly disturbing story. But what David Plotz realized is that he said, "I never learned this. I had a Jewish education. I learned stories of the Torah. They never taught us this." And and as he looks, and as he thinks about it, well, he understands why maybe why, as young kids, that they wouldn't, delve so much into that particular story. But what he realized that now as an adult, there's a whole world of the Hebrew Bible that he just never really explored. And so what he does is essentially this book he writes, again, it's called Good Book. It's very interesting. And what he essentially does is he just decides, I'm going to read every single word of the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to read through it, and I'm going to keep a journal about it. I'm going to comment on it. And that's the journal is essentially the book. And that, a handful of times, he will, he contacted a couple of, authorities, some modern biblical authorities. In other words, he talked to some professors and teachers and faith leaders just about their perspective on it. But for the most part, these are his observations, and his observations are often very thoughtful. As somebody who, again, grew up Jewish, but and certainly identifies as a Jew and is proud to be Jewish, but doesn't wouldn't consider himself an observant Jew. But he had a lot of, he learned a lot of things, and there were times where he would comment on something, and I remember there are a couple of different entries where he would write, "These chapters are very boring," and there are other times where he says, "Whoa, who saw this coming?" And so all of this is a preface to say that he as he begins to look at certain biblical characters, he is surprised to find some that he finds really not very likable, that he thought would be likable. Like, for instance, he's not a big fan of Jacob. He's not a big fan of Aaron. And then there are some characters who really who surprises him. It's a very happy surprise, and perhaps the happiest surprise is that of Gideon. And in fact, he talks about it with his wife, and as it turns out, that when they later had a son, they named him Gideon. That's how much he, admired the character. So, all right, so who is this Gideon? So Telushkin says the section, he calls the section Gideon, the man who would not be king. He writes, during their early years in Canaan, the Israelites often find themselves dominated and exploited by their neighbors. At some point during the 12th century BCE, Midianite gangs start to swoop down on Israelite farms to destroy houses and steal produce and cattle. The marauders ride on camels, which had been domesticated only a short time earlier, and the Israelites, who have not yet domesticated camels, feel overwhelmed and terrified. God sends an angel to Gideon, a member of the northern tribe of Manasseh. The young man is threshing wheat in the cramped space of a winepress so as to hide the grain from the Midianite troops. When the angel greets him in the name of God, Gideon responds in a manner that sounds somewhat like an anguished post-Holocaust Jew. He says, if God is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all God's wonderful deeds about which our fathers have told us, declaring, did not God take us out of Egypt? But now God has abandoned us and delivered us into the hand of Midian. So Gideon is saying, oh, okay, great. Now God's stepping in? Where's God been all this time? Many of us have had this feeling from time to time, like, oh, really? Now God wants to step in? Okay. Telushkin writes, in the next verse, God speaks directly to him. He expresses no annoyance at the young man's challenging words, but also offers no response to Gideon's provocative questions. God never really does. Instead, God commands Gideon to save Israel from Midian and promises to be with him. So what happens is that Gideon winds up becoming this, the leader, a job that, a job that he never had wanted, never asked for, never imagined himself being, and he winds up being incredibly effective in spite of the long odds. At one point, when Gideon is fighting against the Midianites, the Israelites were outnumbered in their army by a ratio of 450 to 1. And God provides great acts, great miracles. So, Gideon pursues the battle until he fully vanquishes his Midianite foes. The Israelites are so grateful that they offer Gideon and his descendants the kingship. Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson, for you have saved us from Midian. I will not rule over you, Gideon responds, and my son will not rule over you. Adonai will rule over you. In other words, here, Gideon, take the crown. And Gideon says, I'll pass. How many people pass that up? Now, what winds up happening though, and Gideon is not a one-dimensional character. It turns out he does have some negative qualities. He does expect a little bit of, at least some reward. And what he does is he does take some of the gold captured by the people, and he forms it into an ephod, a garment, which winds up being used as a pagan image used for divination. And what happens is that the Israelites fall back into idolatry. And then Gideon kind of starts acting like he's the king anyway. Telushkin writes, while the Bible does not tell us precisely how many wives he took, the number must have been considerable, for they gave birth to 70 sons. But even this is not sufficient for Gideon, who takes a concubine, apparently a Canaanite woman from Shechem. He calls the son she bears him Abimelech, a Hebrew name meaning my God is king. We have reason to believe, therefore, that the aging Gideon subsequently might have regretted his refusal to be king. Although Gideon saves his people from the Midianites and brings them 40 years of peace in the process, his moral impact proves negligible. As soon as he dies, the Israelites lapse back into worship of Baal. But despite his later corruption, Gideon does, however, bequeath future generations that one marvelous verse, which epitomizes a moral leader who is a true servant of God. I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. Adonai will rule over you. So Gideon's not a saint. Gideon is not immune to some trappings of power. But there are these moments of great decency. And it just reminds us that so many of the great, the heroes of the Tanakh are, of course, they're very flawed. And even someone as Gideon, who is just unbelievably selfless at one point, turns out he's got a couple of vices. But it does remind us that even the most flawed of us, when presented with the opportunity to do the right thing, if we take that opportunity, if we do what's right in the moment, it can be a tremendous example for many generations. You think about, and I'm not trying to make a direct comparison, but you'd say, one person who exemplifies that was Oskar Schindler, who was a man in many parts of his life of great corruption, a womanizer, plenty of things to not like about the man. What do you say about 1,100 Jews saved? During the Shoah. How many generations have him to thank for that, in spite of some of his personal vices? So, we don't have to admire everything about a person, but when they do something incredibly noble, it's worth a lot. Doesn't overcome everything, but it's worth a lot. 2 minutes? Okay, 2 minutes. I think we're good. Unless you got a question. Yeah. A couple of stories. So, as a lot of you know, by the way, I'm a big fan of Telushkin's books. He really just, he has this way of boiling down complicated concepts or, important concepts and just doing it in a very warm and inviting way. Never gets too high or too low. It's just it's very nice what he does, I think. Do you want me to daven? Do you want to daven? Right? Okay. All right, why not? All right. Okay, so Mariv for a weekday in which we are saying goodbye to the holiday and moving on with the week. We turn to page 281. We rise briefly for the start of the service. Vehu rachum yechaper avon v'lo yashchid v'yirbal v'yashiva po v'lo ya'ir kol chamato Adonai hoshia hamelech yaneinu v'yom koreinu. You may be seated, Baruch Atah. El chai v'kayam tamidim lo cholenu le'olam va'ed baruch atah Adonai amari v'aravim avad olam v'dizor. V'yavad chal tasir mimenu le'olamim baruch atah Adonai ohev amo Yisrael el melech deman Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. V'yahavta et Adonai Elohecha v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol me'odecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shivtecha b'veitecha uvlechtecha v'aderech u'shochbecha uv'kumecha Ukshartam leota yadecha va'yulatotafo benenecha uchtavtam al mezuzot beitecha uvisharecha v'yamshu. Ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liod lachem le'Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem. Middle of 283. Umalchuto b'ratzon kiblu aleihem Moshe v'nei Yisrael chanu shira b'simcha rabba v'yamru chulam bichamocha be'elim Adonai mikamocha nedar b'kodesh norati lo dosefele malchutecha uvanecha bokei hayam lifnei Moshe ze'elianu v'yamru Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed v'ne'emar kifad Adonai Yaakov u'gialo mi'ad chazak mimenu baruch atah Adonai ka'al Yisrael. Ushmor tzeitenu v'leinu l'chaim u'shalom mi'ata v'yad olam baruch atah Adonai shomer amo Yisrael ad. Baruch Adonai. כי המלכות שלך היא עול מאוד עד תמלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד ועל כל מעשיו. Pages 286 through 291, we recite the Amidah individually. Please remember on 287, the extra paragraph for the conclusion of a Chag. Oh, wait, here, I'll put this back while I'm thinking of it.
You decide. I'm just giving you some numbers.
Okay. Go ahead.
We should discuss Saturday morning.
Indeed.
It's your call. You're the boss.
All right. Okay, 297, we rise for Aleinu. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, l'tzeit kedula liotzer bereshit, shelo asanu kagoye ha'aratzot, velo samanu kimishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, v'gor aleinu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech, Malachei HaMalachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shehu Noteh Shemayim V'Aretz. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני מלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד. In my time of need to reflect on and hope for a better world, the proper setting to recite the words Yikadal v'Yikadash Shemeh Rabbah is not available to me, but the words still call V'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon uv'yomechon, that God's rule soon be accepted during my life. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, praised and celebrated, lauded and worshipped. May you bring peace to the universe, all of us, and to me. Amen. So we'll turn to $2.99, which is a very good price. And as a friendly reminder, when it comes to Havdalah, when it is not on Shabbat, all you got to do is the blessing over the wine and the final paragraph. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol, ben or lechoshech, ben Yisrael la'amim, ben yom hashvi'i l'sheshet yemei ha'ma'aseh. Baruch atah Adonai hamavdil ben kodesh lechol. Shavuot tov.
Routine.
No, 42 minutes, actually.
Yes.
So it's kind of like 8:41, right?
Yeah, well, candlelight was whatever, but 8:51 should be it today, that's all.
So what, so the general, right, so the general formula that I've used.
Okay, and I want to point out,
The general formula I use is, like it's essentially whatever candlelight time was, it's an hour after.
oh, okay,
So what that means is that, so the 42-minute thing, that is important.
yeah,
Candlelight time. Essentially, whatever we call candlelight time, it is 18 minutes to speak.
right,
So you have that 18-minute buffer,
right,
and then the idea is that after Shkia is 42 minutes.
okay,
So,
all right. There's a lot, I guess, and I know Chabad, I think, goes 72 minutes.
yeah, exactly. I mean, there's like a ton of different things.
Yeah,
But I mean, that was my Hillel rabbi in, Orthodox rabbi at school kind of gave me that general,
fine,
So, just, I mean, for information.
thank you, I appreciate it. Yasher Torah.